Bostic suspected every birder he met of doing a big year. And he'd do anything he could to distract him.
Seasickness? I feel for it. That's the worst.
These usually help.
Yeah, some people say they're just a placebo. Who knows? Oh, here we go. Cod liver oil. Tracks birds like honey, but smells like fried cat puke. Sorry, I should have said puke.
Won't bother me. Lost my sense of smell in a chem lab explosion years ago.
That's lucky. Now, you want to be careful with those binocs, because once you lose sight of that horizon, you can get lost, and then you're done for, because all you feel is the pitching and tossing. Pitching and tossing.
I'm fine. I'm fine.
Hey, anybody up for a little fish head sushi? Pitching and tossing.
Making somebody actually be more seasick is perhaps the biggest offense Owen Wilson commits in this movie. Yes, I know he ditches his wife and her trying to get pregnant, but like, no, you don't mess with somebody's equilibrium, man. And welcome to the Cinema Psych Podcast, the podcast where psychology meets film. I am your host, Dr. Alex Swan, and in today's episode, we are going to be watching a lot of birds. We're going to try to find birds. We're going to be using binoculars. Yeah, we're talking the big year. And interestingly, this movie came out in 2011, and I was just looking through my recent films list that have been on the show, and 2011 was a big year for psych-related movies. So, phenomenally, we've got another 2011 movie. So, the big year. Now, if you're not familiar, the big year is about birding, bird watching. It's all about a competition with no prize money, no trophy, just bragging rights on seeing the most bird species in a given calendar year. Yep, that's it. It's a year-long bird spotting competition.
How do you become the greatest birder in the world? You have to win the big year. What's a big year? Here, I'll let this English guy tell you.
Well into the 19th century, Americans celebrated Christmas Day with contests to kill the most birds in a single day. In 1900, Audubon Society ornithologist Frank Chapman suggested Americans should count them instead, leading eventually to the creation of the Big Year, a competition to see the greatest number of birds in North America in a calendar year.
Whoa! Whoa!
In 2003, New Jersey roofing contractor Kenny Bostic's big year resulted in an astonishing 732 species, breaking Sandy Comita's North American record. Many believed that Bostic's record of 732 would stand forever, especially Mrs. Bostic.
A big year? Kenny, you promised me you were never going to do another big year.
Well, that was before El Nino. Now I'm really worried someone's going to try to beat 732.
Bostic was right. Somebody was going to try to beat 732. Yours truly.
It was directed by David Frankel, written by Howard Franklin and Marc Obmazchik, and it stars in, interestingly, sort of kind of the height of careers, so to speak, for pretty much everyone, maybe not Steve Martin, but it's got Steve Martin, it's got Owen Wilson, it's got Jack Black. Jack Black does the narration as he's sort of talking about the year that was, I think is how you're supposed to take it, right? The year, the big year had already passed, and so he's like talking about the year that was, and he's narrating it from what seems to be some sort of omniscient standpoint. We'll forgive that for the nature of the film. There are a lot of other great stars in this that have wonderful roles. John Cleese narrates the beginning, which is amazing. And then there is an extended version of this film where he narrates the whole thing instead of Jack Black. We've got Rosamund Pike, Kevin Pollak, Joel McHale, Jo Beth Williams. There's Diane Wiest. Oh, so good. Anyways, Owen Wilson plays Kenny Bostic, who is the leading and has a record of most bird species in a given big year. So he has got a record to maintain. Jack Black is doing his first big year, and Steve Martin as Stu Priestler is moving his body into retirement and trying to get rid of his big old company, and he wants to do a big year and befriends Jack Black, but Brad Harris. So Brad Harris is our main character. I would say Kenny Bostic is also, Owen Wilson is also a main character, and Steve Martin. I think the three of them all have stories that we follow. So they're kind of, it's kind of like a 3-person show. Although Owen Wilson's Kenny Bostic, referred to in the film throughout as Bostic, is a terrible human being. Like literally a terrible human being. So we've got that going for him. I mean, he's trying to see birds instead of Rosamund Pike. I mean, that's just ridiculous, don't you think? In any case, we've got this wonderful movie. It's about the Audubon Society. The Audubon Society is the society that tracks bird species in the United States, and there are a lot of interesting things to note about birds and the Audubon Society and the big year, which is a real thing, and all of that kind of stuff. And during the end credits, a photo of every bird found by the winner, who, spoiler alert, is Bostic once again. But Brad comes in second place, which is amazing. All of the birds seen by Bostic are shown during the end credits. I think that's pretty cool because not only is it part of the film, but it is a great way to have people stick around for credits. And because we don't see a lot of the birds in the film, that there are scenes here and there where you see what the characters are looking at, the birds that they could get on film, of course, but then they have to kind of act in certain places of seeing different species of birds that may or may not have been there, probably not be there, right? 836 species of birds is as of 2019, the current big year record, 836. And this is traveling all over, right? It's all over. The other interesting thing that I want to that I want to add here is that, two things actually from the IMDb trivia section, which is that to do a big year costs around $40,000. Considering that you're chasing rare birds that may or may not be in the right place at the right time, right? You have to strategically move about the country, right? And it's only U.S., so you can only go to U.S. locations. So you can go to Alaska, and they try to get to Attu Island, which is, that whole thing is a goof in the whole movie, but whatever. We'll take it for what it is. But so they're going to Alaska, Florida, Hawaii, Maine, all around the contiguous United States. But that's the big year. It is only in the United States. $40,000. Now that figure was pre-pandemic. I'm betting it's closer to $60,000 now, right? With inflation and costs of travel increasing, all of the things that have changed in the last 5 or 6 years. Wild. The other bit of information is that, in case you're not aware, Steve Martin is a musician as well. He is a phenomenal banjo player. Anytime I see Steve Martin playing a banjo on the internet, I have to stop and listen. I have to stop, watch, and listen. He had a companion album with the Steep Canyon Rangers, Steve Martin and the Steep Canyon Rangers. He had an album that came out with this movie in 2011 called Rare Bird Alert, while he was on set for this movie. So while he was doing downtime stuff, different shots of different people, he was writing his music, Rare Bird Alert, which I think is pretty cool. Again, banjo. So our guest today is also a birder, which I think is great. So birder, psychologist. This movie is perfect. So let's fly right in. My guest host today is Dr. Marc Klippenstine. You might recognize Marc from 2 early podcast episodes, episode 2 on Castaway and episode 16 on Red Dragon, which came out in 2020, 5 years ago. And it has certainly been a really long time. So just to refresh you on who Marc is, he holds a doctorate from York University in Toronto, Canada. His academic interests include forensic and law psychology, physiological psychology, and experimental design and stats. His research focuses on social psychology and the intersection of law and psychology, particularly the social psychology of jury decision-making, although most of his time now goes towards the administrative tasks of running his department and advocating for psych students at the university and across the state. He is currently a professor and chair in the Department of Psychology at East Central University, where he's been since 2007. Marc, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Alex. I'm so happy to be back. It's been a while. We were kind of chatting before we started about what 2020 was like, and I'm glad that is way in the past. I'm glad we are way past that aspect of our lives. So
right.
It's great to be back.
Absolutely. So I'm happy to have you back. It's been a while, as we said. And, I reached out to you to see if you'd like to join again before I hit the 100 episode milestone. And you came back pretty quickly with our film today, The Big Year. And I wanted to ask you, before we jump into the psychology of the movie per the show, I wanted to ask you what made you think of this movie so darn quickly?
Well, I am a birder. Me and my partner are avid birders. We spend our weekends and our vacations and every free moment that we have looking at birds and chasing rare birds. And so this was our movie. This is our sports movie that we can get super excited about. And, that's kind of what popped into my brain as like, that would be a good movie to do. Mm-hmm. Just because we've kind of lived that, and we've done it more recently now that my kiddo's getting a little bit older. He's getting into birding and bird watching, and so we can get him up at 3:00 in the morning and say, "Hey, we're gonna go see a rare bird in Kansas. Let's go!" And he's ready to go. And so it kind of hit home in terms of that. I'm connected to the movie and on that very personal level. Okay, I've lived a lot of what they're talking about.
What's your big year, Ben? What's your highest number?
Well, the funny thing is we don't. I was looking through it today, and I have a life list, and so we don't usually do like a big year necessarily because it is sporadic based on our jobs. But I think I have 357 birds that I've seen
in total.
Total, yeah.
Okay,
total 357 birds, and that's probably a little short of what it really is. There's a lot that are on the list that we haven't confirmed. We try to do confirmed, for sure that's what it is. My wife probably has more because she actually studied birds in undergrad and did her master's on them and then worked on a Ph.D. on that. Yeah. And so she is an ornithologist by trade.
Excellent.
And so that's what she does in her spare time. And so that's kind of what we do is we just kind of chase those rare birds and go see something that isn't normally seen in a particular area, which is kind of an interesting prospect in and of itself.
Did she get you into the birding, or were you already interested in it?
That's a great question. That's a very complex question. I actually met my wife because she was in a research lab in Canada working with my brother, who was working on a master's degree, also studying birds. So we connected that way. So I was familiar with it, but didn't really spend a lot of time doing it. I had helped my brother on a few of his projects, but then met her when she was working on her doctorate studying birds. Yeah. And then we kind of connected that way, and then kind of really got involved with it from there. Knew what birds were, but didn't really spend a lot of time on it. My grandparents had bird feeders up, and we always watched hummingbirds and blue jays, and they put up feeders and that kind of stuff. So I was connected to it, but not really in the intense way that birding can be sometimes, like driving 12 hours to see a rare bird and then seeing it for 30 seconds and turning around and leaving and going home again. That's kind of the world we live in sometimes.
And that's the nature of this movie, right? So before we get into the psych of it, I wanted to get your thoughts on the movie, acting, directing, plot, etc. Does it encapsulate birding for you?
It does. It does in a lot of ways. I think it's a really cute movie. I don't know how to describe it other than that. It's like it's kind of basic in its plot. There's not a lot of surprises. It's, if someone told you what this movie was and who was in it, you'd probably be able to pick out the plot in the first 10 minutes and follow through pretty.
I don't know.
Quickly.
So I think I was very, as far as predictability goes, I was very surprised that Bostic does his wife dirty like that at the end. It's I read so the genrering for this film is comedy drama. Okay, so comedy first, drama second. Call it a dramedy if you want. But the end is for at least Bostwick is fairly sad and lonely.
Yeah, I think I thought about that a lot. I watched the movie again last night just to have it fresh in my brain.
Sure.
And I thought the same thing too. I'm just like, man, they could have ended this very differently. Like if it was a full up comedy, he would have ended, coming to his realization that he should have, run back to his wife and, those kinds of things. And and maybe turn that around, but that didn't happen. A couple of those scenes at the very end kind of hit that the choices he made really had driven his life towards the bird, at the expense of relationships.
Way more realistic in that sense, right? Here are the consequences of your actions kind of thing. Whereas, as you said, a strict comedy would have the main character, because I consider all three of them to be main characters because they have their own stories, right, that we follow intersectionally, right? He would have, like you said, come to his realization, and he would have been like, screw the big year record. I'm going to go back and celebrate or attempt to help my wife with her fertility issues, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to have a baby, that kind of thing. And that would be more comedy, feel-good story-like, but that it doesn't end that way for him. But for Stu and Brad, it certainly does. And I think those story beats are there. As the comedy bits, Jack Black doing a drama is always an interesting thing, as well as Steve Martin too. Like, he's not known for his dramatic chops.
Yeah, for sure. It interests me. One of the things I notice is like, man, they have a lot of heavy hitters in this movie, right?
They do.
Like when it first came out, I'm like, I think it would have been a really interesting movie if they had just a Jack Black or just a Steve Martin or just Owen, but the fact that all three of them are together, and then all that supporting cast too. I was shocked yesterday when I was like, Kevin Pollak's in this, Rashida Jones is in this, Joel McHale, like all these people seem to be peppered throughout the movie, and not in giant roles. Those could have been played by anybody.
Right.
Really. And so it was interesting that, they did have so much of that support in terms of actors in this movie, which I thought was interesting.
And Brian Dennehy too, like R.I.P., right?
Yeah.
He plays the hard but comes around dad figure quite well, right? He's not into he's dad to Jack Black's Brad, and he's just like, this hobby is ridiculous. You're basically spending all of this money to see birds. Like, what's the deal, right?
Yeah.
But then he comes around because he finds out that through Stu, who is more of his contemporary as far as age is concerned, he finds that, Brad's really into this. And this is like a way that they could connect with each other. And I think that was, like I said, both Stu and Brad's stories are the feel-good ones. And then you've got Bostix, who is the like, that's not, ambition above all, which we'll definitely talk about as we get into the psych stuff. But for me, ended up becoming a little formulaic, and I sort of rated this as a middling kind of film because of that.
One that got away.
That's easy. Snowy Owl. I just can't seem to nail that sucker. I've been out 6 times this year and I still haven't gotten one.
As the birder of the pair here, what strikes you about the birding presented in? How was the birding portrayed in the film?
I think it was fairly, in terms of the activities and the camaraderie and running into the same people. You see that quite a few times. Like, you're like, well, what is the likelihood of these people running into each other over and over again? It's pretty high, because nowadays they have, me and my wife were talking about this last night, and, they used like a phone line, right? You call into a phone line and it gives you the rare bird and where it's at and those kinds of things.
Wow.
That doesn't really exist anymore, but there's Discord groups and there's rare bird alerts and email listservs that come out. And so my wife does monitor those things to see if there's anything in our area, be like, hey, this bird's in Kansas. We can go see that.
Yeah.
Or it's someplace that we can go see or those kinds of things. And so in that respect, it does a really good job of capturing that, like, oh, this bird's here. It's not going to be here for long. Drop what you're doing and go do it. We went a couple weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago, to Galveston to see this rare bird that was from Asia. It's not supposed to be here. It did what they think is a reverse migration.
Oh, interesting.
It was supposed to go left and it went right and ended up here rather than in Central Asia. And so people from all over the, United States were flying and driving to go see this rare bird. And so that scene where near the beginning, where Bostic kind of runs onto this scene of a bird and, pulls up the binoculars and gets his view of it, and then turns around and there's like 50 birders with cameras going off.
Yeah.
That's what that was like, right? You're standing on this, on this bank looking at this rare bird with 50 people there shooting pictures and, trying to see it and with all their scopes. And so in that sense, it's a really real movie. It feels connected to that. Even sitting around, one of my other favorite scenes is when they're in the Attu Islands and they're sitting at the end of the day and they're all sharing kind of war stories of like the rare birds that they saw. That's what we do. Right. When you're sitting around with a bunch of other birders, you're sharing the rare bird you saw or the things that you've chased. And a lot of times you share the same experiences, maybe not at the same time, but they're like, hey, I was there and I went and saw that flamingo in Kansas. And I went and saw, the yellow-headed caracara, which is another one we went and saw. Like we talk about those things, we share those stories. And so it does have that camaraderie and that shared experience that was really well captured in the movie. Now, there's a ton of inaccuracies. That's the thing that birders hate.
That's what, before you get into inaccuracies, I wanted to ask you as far as like the good portrayal, because I found this interesting. Of course, John Cleese narrates the beginning of the film and tells the audience what is about the big year, like everything that you would need to know to follow the plot of the film. And so one of the things that struck me and is mentioned a few more times in the movie is the way that the big year is recorded, which is on the honor system, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing that caught me was that it's either by sight or by sound. Okay.
Yeah.
So the number that you represented, the 300 some that you have, are these sighted that you have seen?
That's a good question. Most of them are sighted birds. Yeah. Most of them I usually count as now I am not very good at birding by ear.
Okay.
And I've tried to learn. I've been trying for 20 years and it just doesn't. My bottom up processing does not capture the birds the way my wife
we'll definitely get into that. Yeah.
But my wife can sit and listen. She does bird surveys actually for the U.S. Geological Survey. So every year, we're fixing to start doing them again, where we'll go on this 25-mile trek.
Mhm.
And every half mile we stop, and she actually doesn't bird by sight. She birds by ear at that point, right? So she'll just sit and we'll listen, and then you set a timer, and for 3 minutes, she just notes all the birds that she can hear.
Okay.
In that period. And so she's really good at recognizing that's a cardinal, that's a painted bunting, and doing that. So there's a lot of people who do that very, very well. And so Jack Black's character, Brad, who's really good at doing that. There are people who are amazing at birding by ear. And that is one way to recognize those birds. If you can identify that bird by the sound, then that count in terms of that big ear count and those life list counts. And I think people try to get a look at it. I think that's the goal, is to always see the bird.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not always possible, because some of these, small nondescript bird flying around at the treetop is hard to see sometimes.
Yeah.
And we've spent hours trying, and you still can't see it, but you'll hear it.
Okay.
And so in your mind, you're like, okay, check. I theoretically got the bird, but I really want to see the bird.
Okay, so the honor system then, has anybody challenged its appropriateness for this competition?
I think yes and no. I think in a lot of ways, I had this conversation with the recent bird chase we went on, someone who was coming up to see the rare bird. And he said it's moving, in his mind, it's moving more towards, you kind of need photographic evidence.
Okay.
Because it is so much easier to do nowadays. The equipment's not as expensive. It's easier to get access to those things. And so it is kind of heading that way, but it is still largely the honor system, in terms of seeing and identifying those things, just because of the nature of what the task is. Like, you can't always see this bird. It's just, sometimes it is just a sound identification that you get, but you do have to be careful, because some birds sound alike. There's mockingbirds which mimic other birds, and so you get used to it's challenging. It's a challenging thing to do, and so I think the honor system is always going to be there as part of this.
Okay,
because I don't think you'll ever be able to get a picture of every single bird that you try to go out there and see.
And my last question about the things that they did well, which was to note that the big year competition does not come with any prize money or any trophy. Is essentially just bragging rights. So as a birder yourself, do you think that is how it should stay, or do you think there should be some added incentive?
It would be great if there was added incentive. I think it would be great if there was and I'll share two things. It'd be great if there was sponsorship and those kinds of things, and people do that. But in some ways there kind of is. Recently there was a birder who she got the most birds that year.
Okay.
And again, they base it differently depending on whether you're doing it in the contiguous United States, whether you include all of North America.
Okay.
There also is an ABA, American Bird Association, where they will actually quantify whether a bird is a release bird or whether it's an official bird. And so they actually keep track.
Official
and so
bird.
Sometimes people are like, well, this is a captured bird, based on its behavior, so it doesn't count for a bird list. And so there is someone that evaluates that side of things. There's eBird now, which is a way that you can track your bird lists. So when it's an app, so when you're out, you can keep track of which birds you see and identify. And if you identify that you've seen a bird that shouldn't be in an area, they'll challenge it. And so there is some of that challenge that goes on with that. I know we're kind of returning to a previous conversation, but in terms of sponsorship and stuff like that, this individual who recently got this big ear ended up getting sponsorships from some big binocular companies and equipment companies, and so now she reps for them while she's out doing that. So she's turned it into a business, and bird guiding. A lot of it use this as a way to jump off into the bird guiding world, because people want to see these things. And sometimes it's not possible. If you were just doing this on your own, I think it'd be very hard to go do and see all these birds without some sort of help, either from the community or from a bird guide. And so people will pay other people to help them see these things. And I think that's where the accolades come. If you can say, hey, I'm, a big year individual, and here's how many bird counts I have, you just have a little bit more credence to what you do as a profession, I think.
Okay. Now, briefly, what were some of the inaccuracies that you spotted?
It's funny because, again, I don't think this is something that, I think this probably happens with every specialized world within a movie, right? They oversimplify, they make it cinematic rather than accurate. because that's just what it is, right?
Yeah.
But a lot of times they'll have birds in the wrong environment. So like I think it's near the beginning, they have like one of the hawks, I think it's a Swainson's hawk, in like a snowy environment. Well, they don't stay here for the winter. They leave for the winter and they go down to like South America. And so again, it's just one of those things that I don't think anyone would recognize that besides someone who does those kinds of things. The classic one they always do, and this is in almost every movie, is that if you see an eagle flying around, they almost always use a red-tailed hawk screech as the sound of the eagle. That's like a pretty standard one. And so that always drives birders crazy. That doesn't bother me as much because it's like, they're representing what we do. And so, there's going to be some cinematic license to make it exciting. Yeah. And they're not going to try to show the little tiny birds in the actual environment. They're going to show the big birds, the owls, the snowy owls, and those kinds of things that are exciting.
Living in Illinois, I've seen a lot of bald eagles now. And of course, not once have I heard a shriek like that because, of course, and I learned that back in, 20 years ago now when the Colbert Report started on Comedy Central, and the end of the theme music there was computer generated eagle screeching, and it was and you were like, wait a minute, that's a hawk sound. But Stephen Colbert chose that on purpose because of the nature of the show. Like he's this his character was this idiot, and so of course wouldn't know the difference between the sounds of a bald eagle and that of a hawk, right? And they chose that on purpose because it makes the eagle seem more terrifying, I suppose, and more patriotic, I guess. But yeah, that's when I learned that bald eagles don't sound like that.
Well, it's bald eagles don't sound very majestic.
No, they
in
don't.
The grand scheme.
They look great.
Yeah, it makes sense cinematically to do that. Yeah. Some of those things they highlight in this movie. They highlight a lot of the competition. I don't think it's quite as competitive as that. Like everyone wants to see the bird themselves, but they're also very happy to help each other. I don't think anyone's pulling dirty tricks. Like Bostic at that one point pretends like he got a phone call and that the bird changed locations just to like steer them the wrong way. Mm-hmm. I don't think that kind of thing happens.
Rents a car and then drives around the corner and he's such a dick. He really is. Like I immediately first I thought, okay, he's just a kind of sarcastic jerk. But then as the movie goes on, it's just like, wow, you are an actual jerk.
Yeah, they double down on it, right? They don't lessen up on that as and they picked a good actor to do that. I think that's why I like Owen Wilson. Owen Wilson plays that character, that kind of pompous, know-it-all.
He does do
kind
that
of character. He does that really well.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't surprise me. And actually, I think they casted really well for this movie. Mm-hmm. With Jack Black as that kind of fumbling,
green behind
character.
The ears kind of guy. Yeah, that's where he was in his career. I don't think he could do that anymore, considering he's sort of pigeonholed himself into these like really goofy roles, like Bowser in the Mario movie, and then just recently, I don't know if you saw the Minecraft movie, and Steve, like his Steve guy, all I hear is Steve's lava chicken in my house now.
I have not seen it yet, but my son wants to go see it. We're planning to do it probably in the next couple weeks.
So good luck with that one.
You ever get the feeling you're being followed?
Hello, Master.
How you doing, Stu? Still filling those weekends, I see. Unless you and your son here are doing a big year.
Kenny Bostic, this is my friend, Brad Harris, who's also not doing a big year.
Big-footed goose! Big-footed goose, other end of the boardwalk!
Oh, you're careful. Excuse me.
Hey, put her down! Hey, please, let the explorers through.
Of course.
Let's go, ladies. Sheesh.
After you kids, get those badges.
Chop, 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 chop. Stepping lively. Moving along. Thank you.
Took off, headed north, probably be in Iceland by Friday. Of course, she was a beaut, too. Hey, is that a calliope? Nah. Sorry to disappoint you, boys. Again.
All right. I think it would be phenomenal to jump into the psych of all of this bird watching. So you mentioned it, and I think this is perfect, a perfect opening topic, an opening concept here. And you mentioned it just a little bit ago, the bottom-up processing of birding by sight versus birding by ear. And of course, the opposite of bottom-up processing is top-down. So Marc, tell us what you're trying to suggest with top-down versus bottom-up processing.
Well, for me, what I really see it as, bottom-up is this idea of capturing just the qualities of something, right? So the qualities of the sound or the actual physical nature of that. And so a lot of birding is based on that bottom-up processing of recognizing sound and sound distinctions and sound waves and, pitch and timbre and all those kinds of aspects of a song. That's how you're really identifying those birds, right? You're identifying them by that sound. And, a lot of birds are named from their sound because they're so identifiable, right? So the one that pops into my head is a phoebe. We have like these Eastern phoebes here, and their sound is like Phoebe, 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 Phoebe. And so it is very much a, sounds like their name. And so that is really a bottom up process for me, right? Recognizing sound, recognizing that. And same thing with sight, right? You're recognizing shape, you're recognizing color, you're recognizing a lot of those just basic qualities, right?
Sure.
And so if you are sitting with a group of birders and you're trying to identify something, and the things they're going to ask are, what's the shape? What's the color? What did it sound like? Those are all bottom-up qualities.
Yeah,
when we switch to that top-down part of it, it's really that previous knowledge of what bird should be here. Why is it this bird versus that bird? Why is it a cardinal and not a something else? Right. And a lot of that has to do with that top-down knowledge. Things that people often get incorrect, particularly when you're starting out in this hobby, is they often assume that what they're seeing is the rare bird, right?
Okay.
They always want to go for, it's the horses versus zebras idea. They always want to call it a zebra. They always want to call it the rare thing.
Yeah.
As opposed to like the common thing. And that's that top down part coming through where, what should be in an area. That's what we look at, right? If you think you saw something, you will go to, is this bird common here? Is it a breeding bird here? Which basically means, is it going to be here during the breeding season? Is it a migratory bird? And is it just passing through? Because we'll get a lot of those birds. So right now it's spring migration. And so a lot of birds are flying from South America through, the southern United States to go to where they breed further north. And so you'll get a lot of birds that you don't see another way. That's top-down information, right? Knowing that it's a migratory bird and where it is and those aspects of it. And just being familiar with the bird itself and the nature of that animal and that information.
I think that blends into another cognitive psych topic, right? Where, and this is how I explain it to my students when we're going over this, both perception, attention, in the beginning of the semester. You start with the building blocks of bottom-up processing. You gain all of that information, and so color of the bird, right? Is it red? Is it a cardinal? Right? Blue? Is it a jay? Right? These kinds of things, and then you learn the sounds. I have to give a shout out to the PBS Kids show, the Wildcrats, because they have a show on, they have an episode on chickadees and other related birds, I guess. It's a birding episode, I suppose. One of the things that the episode includes chickadees, and as you said, the Phoebe, right? It says Phoebe, Phoebe, but chickadees, chickadee-dee-dee, right?
Yeah.
Chickadee-dee-dee. And we hear those all over the place because they're native to this area, and they spend their time saying chickadee all the time.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, okay, some chickadees are out there, right? So, not saying that I am a chickadee expert anymore or at all, but you get those building blocks, and then you form your knowledge centers. You organize them and say, okay, I hear these sounds now. I know what that is. And you keep doing this and you build expertise, which then separates an expert, somebody who has accumulated knowledge of a given subject, a given topic, a given bit of sensory input to novices. So what separates, and we can use the characters of the movie here, what separates experts and novices as portrayed in the film?
That's a really good question. You know, I think experts for me, particularly when you're talking about birds, are ones that can identify quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And when there's multiple things that are similar in the same environment, right?
Yeah.
So when we're out birding or whatever, you know, my wife has been doing this a lot longer than I have,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm familiar with birds, but she is a much more heavy study of these things. She does what Jack Black was doing with listening to bird songs, right? That's what she listens to sometimes. And so, you know, just that expert level is often just quick identification, right?
Mm-hmm.
Being able to quickly say, not this, it's this.
Yeah.
Because you can quickly move through the information. And I think that's what an expert level is not that novices can't look that information up.
No.
Right. And so you'll often have like a bird guide.
Or make an educated guess. Or
make an educated guess. Exactly.
There,
right.
Yeah.
Exactly. You're doing that. You're making educated guesses, and you're trying to go through a ton of information.
Mm-hmm.
That's honestly the hard part. I think what makes an expert for me, particularly in this area, is the ability to quickly get through it.
Yeah.
Right. To see this is all the information. This is why it's this, and this is why it's not that. Even for a novice who'd be like, well, they look the same to me. Like, and we still struggle with a lot of shorebirds. Shorebirds are notoriously difficult to identify. So like gulls, I almost said seagulls. That's that would have not got me favored with the birding world.
Yeah, I read about
gulls,
that. Yeah.
Gulls are really hard because they have like 4 different levels of changes in their like feather growth and stuff like that. So year 1 they look one way, year 2 they look a different way, and year 3 they look.
Yeah.
And so it's really hard to identify something like that. But experts who do it can say, this is that bird and here's why, and these are the characteristics that make it that way, and here's why it's not something else.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just that quick processing of information, particularly in this world, that I think makes that. And then you see that in the movie, right? You see that with Bostic a lot, being able to quickly identify birds and do that. And even when, you know, there was that one scene where someone said, oh, you heard that bird, I heard that bird, you know, just count it. No one's going to know the difference. He's like, I want to see it. I want to make sure I actually see it, because it could just be I think he called him a Yahoo in the distance. It could be some Yahoo in the distance making that call.
Right, because we see moments before that, them trying to make the call to get a return, right? Yeah, and then some other expertise from some of the more... So that's identifying birds, but like there's also expertise and top-down processing with the actual bird watching, right?
Yeah. I think so, definitely, you know, just in terms of where to go find birds,
mm-hmm.
right? They often will go to different locations to find things. If you need to find a particular bird to get on your list, you know where you can go and the time of year to go do that, and how to do that. So they went to the Attu Islands, which is really a birding hotspot. Not many people go do that. Like that's a pretty uncommon thing to go do. But you know, that knowledge about where that is or where to find those birds is just, again, top-down processing. So being aware of your just environment is sometimes, I think, important top-down information, things that we just all gloss over.
Yeah.
Like you're recognizing what your environment is or where things are at, but not necessarily being familiar with, oh, this is what I'm going to see in this environment, or this is how I can use that information or use that. Even with tech, using proper tools, right?
Yeah.
So using a scope, people often use birding scopes and binoculars.
Mm-hmm.
And you can usually identify level of birder by the type of binoculars and stuff they have. You know, the people that are doing it, I won't say professionally, but more in-depthly,
avidly,
usually have higher quality binoculars. And does it make a difference? I think it does. I think it helps identify when you're trying to distinguish between a lot of those bottom-up things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like being able to see like an eye ring around a bird that's 3 inches in size. If you have really good binoculars, you're going to be able to do that versus poor level binoculars.
Yeah.
Not. And so that's an interesting part of that whole bottom-up, top-down thing too.
So you note in our shared notes here for our discussion, and I want to, before we move on to the next topic, I want to get your thoughts on this, right? So on expertise, expert versus novices, you have unspoken rules and ethics of birding. What should we know What are these unspoken rules?
That's a really good question too. So, like, for example, I'm trying to think of a good example, but so say you're walking up on someone who's, you're going to see a rare bird.
Okay.
And a lot of times people will just be coming and going all day from whatever location you're at. Usually you don't walk in and start yelling, "Hey, where's the bird at?" kind of thing. You're like, you quietly approach, and there's etiquette in terms of that. You usually talk in hushed tones. You don't wear loud clothing.
Okay.
You're not going to show up. So there's a scene with Bostic, and he has like a really bright pink shirt on and those lime green pants. I don't think that he probably would have done that. It's usually more camo colored and muted colors, just because you don't want to be the thing that scares off that bird, right?
Yeah.
We've gone on chases where we're trying to find a bird, and you're sitting there and you're watching a bird respectfully, and someone will come up and they'll charge right up to the bird, and then it leaves. And you don't know where it's going to go, right? It could just leave. It could be gone forever.
They're free to go anywhere they want.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's a lot of etiquette around that.
Okay.
Another big one is playback of songs, right? So all these things have recorded songs of the bird. And so there's a lot of debate whether you should use playback to get a bird to come to you, right? Whether you should play that song so that the bird pops up. Because if you play a song, a bird will pop up a lot of times so that you can see it. And there's a lot of debate as to whether that's ethical or not. And some people fall on both sides. It's kind of one of those gray areas. A lot of guides will use it sporadically and very briefly, but they won't do it 1,000 times.
Yeah.
Right? So they're not going to do that, because essentially you're kind of tasking that bird's energy, right?
Yeah.
So that bird has to get food to feed its family. And if you're just making it come to you because you're pretending you're like a rival, you're kind of making it harder for that bird to survive. And so then you're really maybe having a detrimental impact on that. So there's a lot of debate whether you should use callbacks and stuff or not with birds. And so that's, again, one of those unwritten rules. If someone comes up and is super loud and says, "I'm going to immediately play this song," you're like, okay. And so you try to, model appropriate behavior. And the reason I think it's unspoken is no one sits down and says, "Okay, here's what you're going to do when you show up." You just kind of learn over time. Oh, I probably shouldn't have did that. I probably shouldn't have worn that.
Yeah.
This is what I kind of learned. But there's also a lot of forgiveness in that community, because people also realize that there's a lot of levels of individuals.
It's I would say even the task itself is very complex too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So you got to have you have to have grace, right, for newcomers. And I think Bostic does not do that, right? So you mentioned his colorful clothing, but in many other instances, he acts extremely unethically, right? So we have a flashback to the whale guide, right? The ship, which is just a random cameo from Angelica Houston.
Yeah.
And she hates his guts because he tried to lead a mutiny on a previous year's boat trip, right? Specifically to see whales, right? But no, he wants her to navigate the ship so they could see birds. And she's like, "That's not what my boat is about." Yeah. And so getting people to do things that they don't want to do, right? There's another scene where he skips past and blows past a scout group, right, on a very thin bridge, because
the one where he jumps the fence with the hummingbird, right?
Oh, right. Stay off the grass and ask for the key. Yeah. And he does neither of those things.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, of course, Steve Martin character Stu ends up breaking one of the gnomes.
Yeah.
And it's just like, wait, he's the one who ends up breaking one of the gnomes, and Bostic over here is doing something that is absolutely not great. Him going up to Stu on the boat and just like increasing his seasickness. Yeah. So of course we're gonna put Bostic in the unethical expert category, and Stu and Brad in the ethical groups, because they do the exact opposite of these things throughout the film.
Hey, how many?
You might want to sit down. 707. You?
7:15.
How many?
7:15?
Wow, welcome to the 700 Club, kid. That is rarefied air. Of course, it's this old timer we got to worry about. What's your number?
You don't want to know.
I do. Scare me.
How about 7:30?
Really? All right, have a good day.
But I think you just woke a sleeping dog. Excuse me. Excuse me. Did our friend just say where he was going?
Oh, he wanted directions to the Skagit Wildlife Area.
This is me.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because they really do. And I'm wondering if when they're making the movie, they were thinking of that, like, do we have one character that has this kind of dual ethical, unethical, or do we they almost created archetypes of these individuals, right?
Yeah.
So this really could have been one person, in some ways, or two people, and they kind of create different characters to capture some of these like overarching like archetypal characters, which they often do in movies, right? They often combine things and kind of make it more cinematic again and kind of work that way. And I think that's why they probably did that here. But you see that happen a lot with this movie, is like, he's the bad person and he's like the unethical person. But all that being said, he is the one that doesn't want to cheat when just by hearing the bird, right? He doesn't want to, I want to see the bird. I don't just want to hear it. And so there's that dual character of Bostic too, where he doesn't want to, and it's like, I don't want to do the unethical thing and just count it. Yeah. Because that's what someone claims earlier, is like, hey, couldn't you just add extra birds to your list just because? But he actually treats his birding part as the most ethical part of it, even though he goes about it getting it unethically.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting from that side of things too.
So I want to use that as a segue into Bostic's characterization contrasting with Stu and Brad. And I first want to talk about McClellan's motivation theory, right? So this is an old theory of, but really robust theory of motivation, which sort of separates why people do things, right, into two categories: extrinsic and intrinsic. Extrinsic is more or less some kind of external factor that is prompting somebody to do something. And intrinsic comes from inside, right? So we've got Bostic as being in maybe at the beginning of his life in birding, more intrinsically motivated, but then it quickly becomes an extrinsic motivation, right? Because he is throughout the film only concerned with protecting his record of his big year. And I see that you mentioned previously, you just said a woman, 726, Tiffany Kirsten, back in 2021. So in the intro, I mentioned the 2019 record, but this is a newer record, 726. You see that he is only concerned with maintaining that. And so once he finds out that both Brad and Stu are working on big years, he basically puts head down, full on going into this at the expense of his marriage, as I mentioned, right? And his marriage to Rosamund Pike, which is like, what are you doing, bro? What are you doing?
And the joy of doing it. He doesn't seem to have a lot of joy either. Right. That very final scene of the movie with him it's like 2 seconds before midnight. I think he gets his snowy owl or whatever it is.
Yeah.
That's his nemesis.
His white whale.
Yeah, his white whale. He takes a picture of it. He doesn't look happy, right? He doesn't look like he's enjoying it. It's just a task to get done. And I think that really
get done, to remain number one, to stay at number one, and that's all he has to his name.
Yeah.
He sees his wife. He thinks she's cheating on him. She's like, that's not what it was, but you know what? Even if it was, like, who's who's really to blame in this situation, because you are neglecting me for this one thing that you don't even get any recognition for, other than maybe your name written down next to the total amount of birds in a book somewhere, right?
Yeah. And he identifies as that, right? So you can really see that he identifies as this. I think he even has a little bit of a monologue on that at one point. He's like, this is who I am. I can't let someone else get it, because I identify as this is who I am as a person. And by losing, I'm losing myself. And that's, I think, a really telling point of that character, right? It's like, if I don't do this and I lose this number, then me as an individual ceases to be what I think it is. And that's a really interesting part of that character.
Right. It's his entire ambition encapsulates his personal identity, and that's a very tragic thing when a person states that this is the only thing about them, and if I lose this, then I cease to be. But it's not uncommon. It's not an uncommon mindset, and you see it quite a bit when somebody leaves the military, for example. They will say, especially if they like joined when they were 18, right, and then they retire and they're like, I don't know who I am if not a soldier, right? You see this with athletes who, of course, end up having to leave the sport because they're too old and their body becomes too frail and broken. You know, who am I if not, a football athlete or a runner or etc. Right? And that all speaks to extrinsic motivations, like and identity creation and formation, where it's like this thing that is external to me is the thing that creates my identity. And of course, you know, you could, of course, try to manipulate that as best you can cognitively. But for a lot of people, that kind of reframing doesn't work so much. And it's tragic when you see them and they lose their identity like that. But I think for Bostic's situation, it does make him a bit one-dimensional in the film. His character does not have that character arc that you expect in Western storytelling, and it just makes him his own foil, and it's sad, and that's the drama part.
Yeah, it is very sad. You know, you almost, when you're talking about that, it really made me think about, you know, this movie could have been a very sad, dark comedy.
Yeah,
like in terms of like him losing everything and struggling to do this. Like if they had flipped the story a little bit and maybe make him not get that number at the end, you know, they could have turned this into a very dark movie of him going down into that
into a dark hole because, you know, he didn't get that snowy owl. Actual Moby Dick vibes. Yeah. We don't get that because, of course, there had to be something at the end of the story for him because of the way that the story was written. But yeah, it could have gone like full on Ahab madness, which would have been an interesting choice if Owen Wilson still continued to play it. I know he's played dramatic roles, but he's always had that snark associated with those roles. And so I don't know if he could have played an Ahab-like character, even though of the allegory with Moby Dick.
Intrinsically, we see both, you know, Stu and Brad do the exact opposite almost, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, with Stu coming to the realization that, hey, I'm transitioning away from this job, and you see him fight that over and over again.
Yeah.
And I think it is a good representation of sometimes what happens is that whatever it is, that world keeps pulling you back in because you're connected to it. And you almost have to have that hard break to be like, okay, that's an old part of me and I'm moving into something new. And that's, I think, where a lot of this extrinsic, intrinsic turns into some of that developmental psych stuff, you know, particularly with adult development and those stages we still go through, right? We're still looking for different aspects of our world and different aspects of growth and development. And what do I do now? And transitioning from this is Stu who owns a multi-million-dollar company to this is Stu, grandfather who just enjoys looking at birds,
Such a beautiful story for Stu, and Kevin Pollak and Joel McHale play real jerks. I use the jerk a lot, but because they keep trying to pull him into the sale of the company, or the whole business side of it, and he's like, guys, I'm trying to enjoy the first stage of my retirement. But the beautiful thing about the story for me is that his wife is so supportive of him and understands that as soon as he realizes that he is doing his own big year, like at the beginning of the movie, he's not really, he's like, maybe, well, he's sort of wishy-washy about it. But throughout the whole time, he's like, I am going to attempt a big year. And then he teams up with Brad because he sees a little bit of himself in Brad. But the fact that his wife is just like carrying on with her thing, and they're like, I wish you were here, but it's okay that you're not, kind of communication style between the two of them is frankly wonderful. And I think that extrinsic external reason allows more of Stu's intrinsic motivation, his love for birds, to come out, right?
Yeah,
he loves birds. He loves doing this thing. He loves it. It's a hobby for him. He's never really attempted a big year before, but because he's doing this retirement thing, he'll give it a shot. And then on Brad's side, it's just like, this is something you spend your days working as an IT professional at a job that you dislike to listen to bird songs all day, right?
Or during your break, look at the gulls out on the lake or wherever there. Like, I thought that was like, that actually captures a really important intrinsic moment for me too, is like, sometimes we always call it always be birding, right? That's kind of our mantra, always be birding. So we have a pair of binoculars in every car that we own.
Awesome.
When we go, we have to go to doctor's visits and stuff like that. And when we're around a lake, we're like, hey, let's go grab some lunch. We could go out and have a nice, sit down lunch, go to a nice restaurant, or we could grab something and go sit at the lake and watch birds and have a hamburger. And we often choose that, right? Because it's intrinsically motivating to just enjoyable part of doing it. I think you see that in Brad, how much he actually loves the act of doing it. And that's why it's really neat that he ends up with Rashida Jones's character at the end, is this like, they both love doing the bird thing, right?
Yeah.
So at the very end, he's talking about spending their weekends together, looking at birds and enjoying it just because it is enjoyable to do.
Yeah.
And that contrasts so much with Bostic's character at the end, saying, ending up, they don't say where in China, but he just says in China. And he's there trying to maybe create another big year, trying to do that next thing, just that external component of it. And so very contrasting at the end between those two.
And the cherry on top for Brad is that he is so happy to be number 2. He's so happy. And Rashida Jones is so happy for him. Like, they are like, you're dating the number 2 birder in the country or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's just like, he wears it as a badge of pride. Like, I didn't win, but like, look at the year that I had. And I think the title there does a really good job of pulling double duty and meaning, because it was Brad's big year. Not big year for birding, not the Audubon Society's name for the whole competition, but like, this was a monumental calendar year for this character. It was a monumental calendar year for Stu as well. And it was a big year for Bostic as well, but in the opposite direction. It was a markedly bad year.
Yeah, for sure. I hadn't thought about it. That's a great way to think about this movie, is like that dual meaning of that bigger. I didn't think of that. Now, maybe that's just because of me being the birder person. I'm just like,
right. I'm
on the bird
hearing from the outside.
Hearing it from the outside, it makes perfect sense. When you were talking there for a second, it makes me think of counterfactual thinking. I did my honors thesis on counterfactual counterfactual thinking.
Excellent.
And like that, which I thought was I always talk about that when we talk about like why people are happier if they get, sometimes the person who gets third is happier than the person who gets second.
Yep.
This kind of breaks that rule a little bit, but probably for the same reason, right? Bostic being, if I lose first place, that's going to be the worst thing that could possibly happen for me, right? So he's thinking about what if I don't get first place?
Yeah.
Whereas I think both Stu and Brad are like, hey, this is something that I'm just trying. I want to see if I can actually do this. I want to put this as an important thing in my life as opposed to a secondary thing in my life. And so their what ifs are, what if I actually try my hardest? What if I actually try to get things done?
Right.
Or try to do this big year? And you see them both be successful and happy with their placement because the alternative is not having done it at all. And so I think you see that play through in these characters too, in their comparisons with each other and what if statements of that counterfactual world too.
How many of these damn tests these clowns are going to put me through before they let me get the hell out of here?
Dad, you had a heart attack.
I had a minor heart attack. Right? My old man's day, it was not something you went to the hospital for.
Let me show you some shots from the trip. My little hobby. You should take a look. What we got here? There you go. Colima warbler. It's Texas. Had to hike 8 miles to see that guy. There's the spruce grouse. Maine. That was butt cold. Another spruce grouse. Oh, there's my favorite bird. American golden plover.
That's your favorite bird? It's gray.
Yes, it is. Well, gray-brown. Yeah, a lot of people wouldn't think twice to look at this bird, but this golden plover is one of the greatest travelers in the world. It's true. It breeds in the Arctic tundra, then flies all the way down to Argentina and back all in 1 year. It shows up on beaches of Guatemala, farms in Illinois. 9 inches long, but he travels hundreds of thousands of miles in his lifetime. No passports, no security, total freedom. Yeah. This great bird? Seen some amazing things. That's the bird that everybody underestimates.
So I want to move on to another topic here that sort of encapsulates the whole film, which is the relationship dynamics. And I'm going to sort of blend a couple of topics that you put together with one of the ones that I put together. So relationship dynamics here being sort of broadly defined, right? All types of relationships, not just romantic relationships. So we see a number of relationships here. We've got father and son, as I mentioned, Brian Dennehy being the gruff and Brad, right? We've got mother, son, Brad and his mother, who is his mother's super supportive of him. We've got, of course, romantic relationships mentioned, Stu and his wife, Bostic and his wife. And we have the friend relationship between Stu and Brad. And after a period, and I want to focus on Stu and Brad here, right? Because initially, they are, we'll say, quote unquote, adversaries, but not really. I mean, I'm just using that as a sort of a loaded word on purpose, right? So they are attempting big years themselves and eventually come together, right? So what are some of the dynamics that you see in Brad and Stu throughout the film that they start off as adversaries and then move together?
Yeah, I think there's a couple really telling moments. There's a point where they have a really good day birding, right? And then they go to a restaurant.
Yeah.
And they're sitting down having a restaurant. And it's really the first time that these characters connect on like a personal level, right? They kind of make this turn from that adversaries to working together. And in that moment, you really see them kind of making that decision. Is this, and particularly with Brad, do I share what I'm doing with Stu, right? Do I share this really personal thing that I'm not sure I want out there in the world yet? I'm doing a big year with Stu to say, hey, this is something that I'm doing. And he makes the decision to do that because, and in that moment, there's this level of trust that has developed that you really see their relationship kind of takes it to that next step, right? Not only are we acquaintances, but I'm willing to share something with you that's personal and vulnerable in a lot of ways, right? So they're sharing that vulnerableness of this is something I want to try to do that. And so I think that's a really telling moment for me in that, in the movie, in terms of the development of their relationship. And then as the movie kind of progresses on, they go from, I think at this point, Stu is kind of acting in as a stand-in for the dad.
Yeah.
That Brad kind of wants.
Yeah.
Right. He wants a dad that's supportive and is more like his mom and is wanting to see him succeed. And that doesn't come through at the very beginning until later on. And so he starts to develop that father-son a little bit of relationship. Or maybe at least Brad is finding that in Stu as they're kind of going through this task together.
But right after this, right after Brad says to Stu at this dinner that he's doing a big year, Stu sort of stabs him in the back, right? So what happens there?
At that moment, Stu basically says, and they actually do sometimes I don't like inner monologue in movies because, it's kind of like, let's just really hit this nail on the head. Let's make sure everyone's really aware of what's going on. But that idea of like, hey, I'm not going to share that I'm doing a big year with this person because I don't want that out there. And mostly that he doesn't actually trust Brad to not share it with Bostic, who is seen as the competitor for this, right? And so in some ways, I think it highlights how relationships often work, right? Is that people reach levels of trust with people at different rates. So Brad reached relationship trust with Stu faster than the reverse happened. And that's realistic in a lot of ways, right? Sometimes you're like, well, you may be at this point to share, but I'm not at that point to do that either. And so I think that captures some of that realistic relationship things that happen with individuals.
And then Stu recognizes that he did Brad dirty and comes clean that he too is attempting to do a big year, but recognizes that his shortcomings are probably going to get him in the end, right? This whole company sale that they're attempting to do, him, being hounded by his advisors or lawyers, whoever Joel McHale and Kevin Pollak are, whatever their roles are within the Priestler company. He recognizes that it's probably not going to happen. And he also knows that, his son is expecting a child at any moment. Well, not at any moment, but later in the year, of course, right? So he knows that's going to be something that he's going to have to contend with. And so they turn a competition into a cooperation, right? They combine their efforts.
Yeah, for sure. They eventually turn to like, and a lot of it has to do with Brad's position in his life, right? He is, I think he's supposed to be mid-30s-ish, somewhere in there.
Yeah, that's what it seems like. Yeah.
Like in there. And so recently divorced, doesn't have a lot of money, doesn't have a lot of those like monetary freedoms that Stu has. And so that connection does build on the fact that Stu's at a point in his life where he has that disposable income and those things that can get him further
probably
along.
Has a ton of money.
Yeah, apparently. Because that stuff is not, birding is not cheap anyways, right? When you travel far distances and the fact that they're hopping on planes to go see one bird. I mean, people do that.
Yeah, chartering a plane that looks like that's going to kill them to Attu Island. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I know that, or the helicopter with the helicopter scene where they're flying around chasing like the snowcocks. And so, again, just making those connections and those relationships. One of the things I notice is I don't know if I think Brad kind of feels this fatherly connection to Stu. I don't think that I see the same son relationship coming back from Stu towards Brad. It's more friendship based. I don't know.
I would
don't
say
know if you see that.
Yeah, and I think Stu recognizes that it's not reciprocal in that father-son way, and the filmmakers, I think, make a point of this by having Stu and Brad's dad actually talk on the phone, right? Which prompts, hey, this other guy who is similar to my age is suggesting, who has an adult son, is suggesting that, this is something that he and I can connect with. And of course there's, conveniently a bird in their setting that, where they live, that they could walk to in the forest, right?
Yeah,
to allow the
absolutely,
two of them to connect. And I think that is the role that Stu plays downward in age, I guess, right? So from the older person to the younger person, as opposed to Brad upwardly looking at Stu as a father figure, right? So that is, I think, the full circle moment for their friendship, because we end up, after that sort of that final scene with the two of them, we don't see them together again in the movie. Brad and Stu, we don't see them together. Brad is with Ellie at the end, and Stu goes to where his new grandbaby is.
Yeah, it really does highlight that they came. It's that momentary connection, right? Sometimes you have people in your life where you momentarily come together, you work together for a common goal, and then you separate because it was a temporary group that formed as part of this interaction. And you see that really happen with those characters, and then they kind of use it as a stepping stone to maybe further their own relationships down the road. And I think, there's so many dark places this movie could have went. I always think about that when I watch this movie. Like, Brian Dennehy's character could have died in the woods. That would have had a very different relationship arc for that character. With Stu's family, they could have been not supportive of him,
right?
Or his son could have been upset that he was essentially losing his dad during a really important part of his life, right? I think about that.
Yep.
Like, how would I feel about if my son was having a child and I decided to put efforts towards a hobby of mine? Like, there's something that could have been played with there that wasn't. They kind of played it over as like, Dad, it's fine, I want you to be happy, and it's very supportive of that character, and so that relationship comes through there too. And so there's a lot of different ways this movie could have played out. I'm happy with the way it did play out, but they did simplify a lot of those relationships and those connections between people that probably in a darker movie would have went a completely different way.
Yeah, and I think it also demonstrates a year of two characters receiving a ton of support financially as well as psychologically, right? Where one character, Bostic, is getting the exact opposite. Right. We don't even know what Bostic does for a living and how he himself is affording this. He's got a giant house. He apparently is on his third wife, which is who Rosamund Pike's character is. He's been unsuccessful in having any kids. And maybe that has been the reason for his other failed marriages, or maybe it was the birding that led to his other failed marriages. Right. And so you get these story beats in that way. And I think it's quite interesting to note that.
Well, and that relationship too with Bostic and his wife, trying to go through those fertility treatments. And you see the whole arc of what's happening with, and how long he's really been gone, is that every time he comes back, the renovation that's happening with his house has gone through major advancements for it. And anyone who's gone through renovations, right? The idea that, one time you come home and your house is torn up, and then the next time he's there, it's like a little bit more finished, and it's like, it's roughed in. And then the next time he comes home, it's all a complete finished renovation.
Yeah.
It really tracks time-wise. But just the idea that his wife was actually aware of his drive and motivation for this. And she makes that statement at one point, right? To say, hey, I thought this was going to be different. I thought you said this time that I was going to be your focus and that we weren't going to do all this birding stuff. And so obviously they had conversations about that before, right? This is not the first time they've had disagreements over his activities. And we just don't see that play out in the movie, but you really do see that his character is driven this way, and maybe highlights the fact that what can you and what can't you change about people, and what can be changed as an individual. Like, is it effort-based change that you can make, or is this something that's driving him to be the way he is for some other reason? Is it pathological in some ways in terms of what he's doing?
Can't take our eyes off the ball. You think he lets anything slow him down? I made work my priority and I missed the boat. You got your feelings hurt and you almost quit. No more, Brad. Think like him, act like him. One of us has to beat this SOB. Yeah. Yeah! And here's what you do about Ellie. I don't think I'm ready. Tell her you want to exchange phone numbers in case there's a rare sighting this summer.
I said I'm not ready. But that is a really good idea. Thanks.
Good luck, Stu.
So I want to end with a final discussion about an important thing to note about this film, which is and very Western of this film, which is that the film focuses on three men and all of the women play supporting roles, right? Rosamund Pike, as we said, is Bostic's wife. Ellie ends up becoming at the end of the film, Brad's girlfriend. And though a birder, and an avid birder at that, is not shown and is stated in the movie to not be doing a big year, who has a boyfriend who is not into the whole birding thing. And then Stu's wife, who, like I had said earlier, is just really supportive. And I think that, as you say, brings a bit of it's a bit problematic from this standpoint. What do you think?
You know, I look at this movie and I'm like, it missed so many opportunities for genuine interest and, you know, a little bit more equality in terms of male and female characters. But it really does miss the boat. Like last night, I paid a lot of attention to this when I was watching it. I don't think they have a conversation that isn't relating to the male characters' goals at all.
Yeah, it does not.
Like,
this does not, you know, pass the Bechdel test. This movie does not.
No, it does not at all pass that. And so it is this, you know, it's troublesome from that perspective. I think it also implies that when you look at a lot of the birding groups, it's full of male characters too, right? Very few of them are female birders that are interested in it.
Yeah.
On Ayatu Island, you know, the birder who naively brings his wife along, his new wife along on a honeymoon, you know, even implies that the act of birding is just so outside the realm of women's interest or focus that, you know, it would be obscene for them to be there, or like just be like, oh, I have to have, you know, it's just that character, that scene really bothers me a lot, because being married to someone who is such an avid birder and is actually the driving force behind that, and then being in the community, and I think it's evenly split. You often see both male and female birders out there. I don't see that this should have been that way based on the community. Although it is challenging for male and female birders. I think they go through a lot of different focuses in the real world too.
Yeah.
You mentioned Tiffany Kirsten earlier. She's one that recently had a big year.
Yeah.
And she talks pretty heavily about a lot of the sexism that exists within that world.
Okay.
I've seen it play out with my own wife, where she'll, you know, be identifying something and people won't believe what she says. And I think that's a gender related issue. You know, it's that male chauvinism sometimes coming through. And I think that plays out in this movie a little bit, and it's disheartening.
Yeah.
I think it's the biggest thing that I dislike about this movie. If you just look at it as a whole, I think the fact that they just dropped the ball so heavily on that and focused only on the male characters. I think they easily could have maybe just focused on the male. If that was what they're going to do, just focus on the male characters and just have it as a buddy movie as opposed to a relationship.
Or I think, honestly, Jack Black's Brad character, we're talking, you know, the movie came out in 2011, filmed in 2010. There were and are still phenomenal female comedians who could have made Brad's character a woman. They could have, 100%, and could have turned the table on Ellie's character, Rashida Jones, right? They could have turned the table on. I mean, honestly, could have made Rashida Jones Brad and Jack Black Rashida Jones. They could have swapped those completely. And they could have made Stu's character, you know, still could have had Steve Martin in there, Stu's character, and played a father-daughter kind of friendship. They could have done so many things to sort of make this film a little bit more inclusive to the realities of birding, what you've said. But of course, they decided to make a film that only has male characters conversing with each other, and then all of the female characters sort of talking about them.
I know how great would this movie have been if the ending was that Ellie's character was doing a big year and she actually won the whole competition at the end, and there was this no mention of her at all. That would have been my ideal movie. That would have been a great way to end this movie. Just the surprise ending of whoa, she was doing a big year. There was a lot of ways they could have gone. I don't think it's hard to include that in movies anymore. I think we should be past that.
Mm-hmm.
I think we honestly should be considering that when we're writing these movies, because it's not hard to be like, oh, we have a pretty male centric movie going on here. Is there not a way to change this a little bit, to change the writing? And I think it was originally based off of a book that someone else written, and maybe that's what they were falling true to. But there's ways to make it more inclusive in part of the world. It just seems like a lack of effort.
Yeah, every story is based on a true story or based on a book with fictional characters. It's a fictional movie. You could totally do it. And again, in 2011, we moved way past that. I suppose that was in the decade, that was just leaving the decade of the 2000 aughts, right? Where there was still a lot of movies that came out in that decade are considered problematic these days, right? Like Dude, Where's My Car, or other comedy movies like Mean Girls, etc.
A lot of those early comedies are based off of a lot of that male to female disrespect.
Yeah, that's
right.
true.
And it's when you look back, there's so many of those cringy movies that you're like, oh, I can't believe that's a movie I liked, enjoyed, or whatever, because you didn't think about it. And I'm sure as someone, coming from a male perspective, it's easier for me to look at it from the comedy perspective as opposed to hey, what about women in this movie?
Yeah,
what about
exactly.
that side of things? And so, it is, I wish they had done better. I think they could have done better, but unfortunately they did not.
Alrighty, I want to thank Dr. Marc Klippenstine for joining me to discuss the big year. Before we say goodbye, Marc, is there anything you'd like to plug? Where can folks find out more about the work that you do?
Thank you, Alex. I just want to say thank you again for having me. It's been great. I love chatting with movies with you. It's always fun. I want to plug a couple things. One, go out and go birding. It's fun. It's you can get a pair of binoculars. They don't have to be expensive. You can bird in your backyard. We always try to get everyone involved with birding because it is something that's very easy to connect with nature. It's just get out there, look at some birds. And there's apps now, the Merlin ID app. If you can't identify birds, there's a ton of stuff out there that exists that makes it easier than it used to be.
And I will say before we do end, I failed to mention this before while we were at the beginning, while we were talking about your birding experience. This isn't a video podcast, but listeners, Marc has several bird photographs, some framed, some on canvas, behind him in his office. So, it's legit.
Yeah, I do. We live that life, right? We always be birding. That's what our mantra is. We got to just keep going on with that. The second thing I want to plug is my passion is education. I love what I do for a job. I just enjoy the fact that I have everything that I want. I get to interact with students on so many different levels. And so the last 5 years since we've talked, I've worked really hard to develop a couple new programs on our campus.
Oh, very cool.
One's an online master's in applied psych.
Mm-hmm.
I see too many students wanting to go on to a doc program, but not having enough preparation.
Mm-hmm.
So we built that for that, just to get them more involved with research and get them involved with stuff and prepare them maybe for that doctoral level program.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited about that. We also have an online Master's of Science in Sports Psychology.
Mm-hmm.
We have, a sports psychologist on staff here is a really good friend of mine who works with national athletes,
very cool.
Olympic athletes, and does that and is a great individual if you're interested in sports psych. We're just trying to build that program. And then we do have a new online EDD program, first doctoral program in our university. And I'm teaching a couple classes in that program in rural education in Oklahoma. That's a big thing in Oklahoma is rural education.
Yeah.
And so it's a big filling a big need. So those are the three things I'm working on right now. I don't get to publish very much anymore. I don't get to do my own research.
Right.
I tend to focus more on administrative stuff, but that's how I feel like I'm impacting the world is just by building good programs at our university. It's a regional university, really affordable. And so working with students is my passion, and that's what I love doing. That's the only things I kind of want to plug. And if you want to find out more about me, you can check me out just through the university website at ecok.edu. You can find me in our programs, and that's the best place to get a hold of me.
Excellent. And you can be found on socials?
I can, yeah. Mostly just through my name. You can find me. I'm on Facebook, on Instagram, a few other places. I have a lot of bird photography.
Yeah.
I go by Sistertail Sky Photography is my kind of photography business on the side that I do bird stuff, and that's kind of that side of me.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again for joining me, Mark.
Thank you, Alex.
And that's going to do it for this episode. Until the next one, thanks for listening.